Russia's most famous war blogger just warned his own country about a weapon nobody has seen fired yet. Not because Ukraine doesn't have it, because Ukraine hasn't used it yet. There are 8 days left before a deadline the Ukrainian president announced himself. Today's video is about a theory, floated by one of the most prominent pro-war voices in Russia, that Ukraine has been deliberately holding back its most powerful missiles, and about the very specific date that theory might get tested. Welcome back. Let's start with the man making the argument. Igor Girkin isn't a neutral observer. He's the former militant commander widely credited with helping start the war in eastern Ukraine back in 2014. Now writing from a Russian prison cell where he's serving a sentence on unrelated charges. And he remains one of the most closely followed military commentators on the Russian side of this war. When Girkin raises an alarm about Ukrainian capability, it isn't Kiev talking. It's a committed supporter of the Russian war effort trying to warn his own side. That combination, genuine ideological commitment to Russia's cause, paired with a documented willingness to publicly criticize Russia's own military leadership when he thinks they're getting it wrong, is exactly what makes his analysis worth more scrutiny than the average pro-Kremlin commentator, who typically has far stronger incentives to simply repeat whatever line the defense ministry prefers that week. Here's what he actually wrote. Ukraine has been striking Russian targets almost exclusively with drones lately, not the longer-range Flamingo cruise missiles or the ballistic missiles it's known to have in development. Girkin lays out two possible explanations. One, Russian forces have somehow managed to destroy Ukraine's missile stockpiles at their main storage sites, which he treats as the less likely option. Two, and the one he considers more probable, Ukraine is deliberately saving them, using drones for now against targets that aren't well defended by air defense, while holding the missiles in reserve for something bigger. He arrives at that second explanation essentially by elimination. If Russian strikes had genuinely wiped out Ukraine's missile stockpiles, Russian state media would almost certainly be showcasing that as a major victory, not staying largely silent about it, which makes the quieter explanation deliberate conservation rather than destruction, the one that better fits everything else currently visible on both sides of this specific story. Girkin then makes a point worth sitting with, because it comes from someone whose entire professional incentive is to downplay Ukrainian threats, not inflate them. He argues that Ukraine used to run combined attacks, drones and missiles together, or drones first followed by missiles once air defense had already been drawn out and expended intercepting the first wave. That pattern, he says, has largely stopped. Almost everything hitting Russia right now is drones alone. To a war blogger who's tracked this conflict for years, a change in tactics that consistent isn't random. It looks like preparation. Now, why would Wildberry's warehouses specifically fit into that theory? Girkin's own answer is refreshingly honest for a war supporter. He doesn't think the Wildberries campaign is strategically significant in a military sense. He explicitly says these strikes won't meaningfully damage Russia's actual defense capability. What they do instead, in his reading, is demonstrate to ordinary Russians, including the ones who've spent 4 years assuming this war has nothing to do with them, that a war is actually happening inside their own country. That's psychological pressure, not battlefield damage. Girkin is careful to separate the two rather than conflating them the way some coverage of this war tends to do on both sides. There's a second Russian voice worth adding here, and it comes from an unusual source. Igor Dmitriev, a Ukrainian defector who switched to the Russian side back in 2014. Writing on his own Telegram channel, Dmitriev noted something he found strange while watching videos of Russian business owners crying over their burned inventory, and footage from strikes across the country more broadly. They almost never mention Ukraine. Instead, their anger goes straight at Russia's own leadership and the companies that failed to protect or compensate them. In Dmitriev's words, the war barely exists in how these people talk about their own losses. It comes across more like an unprevented natural disaster than an act by a foreign enemy, because Russia's own government spent years deliberately keeping its population excluded from both decision-making and any realistic picture of what was actually happening. Now, he argues, that same government has to absorb all of the resulting anger itself, with nowhere left to redirect it. It's a striking observation precisely because of who's making it. Someone who chose Russia's side of this conflict over Ukraine's, watching Russia's own population direct their fury inward rather than outward, and apparently unable to resist pointing that pattern out publicly. Put those two Russian analyses together, and you get something more interesting than either one alone. If Girkin is right that Ukraine is holding missiles in reserve, and Dmitriev is right that domestic anger over strikes on ordinary economic targets lands on the Kremlin rather than on Kyiv, then Ukraine's current approach isn't really a choice between military pressure and psychological pressure. It's stacking both at once, grinding away at public patience with cheap, plentiful drones now, while keeping the expensive, harder-to-replace missiles in storage for a moment when their impact matters most. Which brings us to the date. Zelenskyy has publicly referenced a 40-day campaign of intensified strikes. Counting forward from when that campaign was announced, that window closes on August 4th. Girkin, notably, doesn't reference that specific announcement in his own analysis. His theory comes purely from watching Ukrainian targeting patterns shift over recent weeks. No inside knowledge required. But if his read of the pattern is accurate, and if that 40-day window really does mark a deliberate campaign boundary rather than a coincidence of timing, the two threads point toward roughly the same moment, a stockpile that's been quietly building and a countdown that's already running whether or not Moscow wants to watch it. It's worth being clear that these are two independently sourced observations converging on the same rough window, not one confirming the other directly. Girkin never mentions Zelenskyy's 40-day figure, and Ukrainian officials haven't confirmed Girkin's missile hoarding theory. The overlap could easily be coincidence, but it's the kind of coincidence that gets a lot more interesting if the pattern actually holds once the calendar runs out. None of this guarantees a single dramatic strike actually materializes on schedule. Wars don't reliably deliver their climaxes on the calendar dates observers pencil in for them, and military campaigns get delayed, scaled back, or redirected constantly based on conditions nobody outside the planning room can see. Girkin himself hedges his own theory, admitting plainly that he doesn't have full information and could be wrong about the reason behind the pattern he's noticed. That honesty is exactly what makes the theory worth taking seriously, rather than dismissing as either side's wishful thinking. A propagandist trying to score points doesn't usually open his own argument by admitting he might be missing key information, which is precisely what makes this specific admission worth more than the confident certainty most commentary on this war tends to project in either direction. Russia's own most prominent war blogger thinks Ukraine is saving its missiles for something specific. A Ukrainian defector who switched sides in 2014 thinks Russian public anger has nowhere left to go but toward the Kremlin itself. And somewhere in the 8 days between right now and August 4th, both of those theories are either about to be tested in public or quietly proven wrong by a deadline that simply comes and goes, with no fireworks, no announcement, and no one on either side of this war particularly eager to explain afterward which version turned out to be true.